Mr. President, yesterday, the Inspector General for the Department of Interior came out with their report, this investigative report, of which it followed another Inspector General report just a month ago. Two Inspector General reports talking about what's wrong in the Mineral Management Service, the most recent of which is quite disturbing and on the heels of the one a month ago where they found that a culture where the acceptance of gifts from oil and gas companies were widespread throughout the office of the Lake Charles District Mineral Management Service in Louisiana. That, of course, came on the heels of what we discovered years ago in reports about the incestuous, cozy relationship between the oil industry and the regulators that are supposed to see that the oil industry is doing its job and doing it safely and collecting all of the revenues from the royalties that the oil industry is supposed to pay, having drilled on federal lands, which is the sea bottom of the Gulf of Mexico. Well, this latest investigative report points out, and I will quote, "Of greatest concern is the environment in which these inspectors operate, particularly in the case with which they move between the industry and the government." That's called the revolving door. That's somebody in the industry comes into the government as a regulator, and then the revolving door turns and they go back into the industry. Now, how in the world can you have a regulator that is coming from the industry into regulation of that industry and turn in the revolving door and go right back into that industry? Well, that's the problem. And that's what we've got to fix. And so my office is talking with Senator Menendez's office, and it is my intention that we will file today a bill that will do a number of things. It will stop this revolving door by requiring the same thing that we require for ourselves here in the Senate, that when you leave the Senate, you can't go into somebody that had lobbied you as a business that will lobby the Senate for a period of 2 years. That's the minimum we should expect. And that this legislation will also insist on things that are common sense. That the regulators can't accept gifts from the industry that they're regulating. And that they've got to have financial disclosure that would show what the regulator owns if they are in any way compromised with the very industry that they're trying to regulate. And that if they have any outside interest, for example, stock in oil companies that they're regulating, that they would have to divest from that. And furthermore, that in the egregious case, that they would also be partially employed by that outside industry that they are regulating, that clearly that could be prohibited. Now, these are just common sense things. Why isn't this in the law? Senator Menendez and I offered this law 2 years ago when all of these revelations came out in that Inspector General's report back then. But of course, there was enormous pushback on the legislation. Well, sadly, it has come to this great tragedy of thousands and thousands of barrels of oil gushing into the Gulf of Mexico to bring us to this point that we ought to have a willing recipient in this United States Senate to this legislation that we are filing that will stop this cozy, incestuous relationship between the oil industry and the regulators. I know that Secretary Salazar is trying to clean it up, and he's doing what he should do. But what we want to do is to etch it into the statutes so that there is no question about what is the requirement, not just for today, but forever. Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will